Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our show. As Ashenda celebrations take place in Tigray and around the world, we are delighted to introduce our esteemed guest, Ambassador David Shinn, who will share his insights on the cultural and broader affairs of the Horn of Africa. We encourage you to stay with us throughout this interview. Ambassador Shinn, welcome back, and thank you for your willingness to share your insights today. I understand you have been on vacation for the past few weeks. Could you please share some highlights from your vacation? Did you find it enjoyable, relaxing, and entertaining?
Well, first let me just comment on your very nice opening with the Ashenda performance. Every culture has its unique characteristics, and this is obviously one for Tigrayans. Seeing the colorful dress of the young ladies is always a pleasure, and hopefully it's a kind of custom that helps contribute to gender equality in Ethiopia and in Tigray particularly. As far as vacation is concerned, it's always good to go on vacation, sort of clear your head a bit, and I spent most of my time in the San Juan Islands in Washington State. Relaxing on the ocean, doing a lot of short hikes. So it was a very pleasurable time, and I always look forward to getting back home to Washington State, and especially to the San Juan Islands.
The ongoing conflict in the Amhara region has prompted discussions between the United States and European countries. As U.S. Special Envoy Ambassador Mike Hammer is traveling to the Scandinavian countries, what are the key points of contention between the federal government and the regional forces FANO?
Well, this is a very tragic situation, and as you know, it goes well beyond the Amhara region. In recent years, in fact, at least a decade, there have been various local militias set up around Ethiopia, none of which, in my view, is a very useful contribution. In fact, they tend to be very, very harmful to national unity. You really can't have a centralized government that has a whole series of individual, particularly ethnic, organized militias, are well armed, doing their own thing with their own agenda. I mean, if you have that kind of a situation, your central authority simply disappears. Now, this situation has been exacerbated by the fact that the central government was in close alliance with the FANO militia and other militias in Amhara region during the war with Tigray. Then they separated and went their different routes, and the central government is now effectively at war with the FANO militia. This is sort of tantamount to a situation in the United States. If the United States were to allow the Proud Boys or the 2%ers to arm themselves and to engage in whatever policies they wanted to engage in for their own purposes, we would do everything possible to put it down. We just would not allow that kind of a situation. Now, I realize that the ethnic situation in Ethiopia is much different, but you have to have central security authority, and that's what is going on at the moment, trying to install that throughout Amhara region. I know there's considerable support in the diaspora, in the Amhara diaspora, for what Fano is doing. I think, quite frankly, that's not a useful way to proceed. I think that everyone has to acknowledge that there is centralized authority in the country, and that the Fano forces are just not playing a useful role, nor are any other of the localized militia at this point. So this is a huge challenge for Ethiopia at the moment. I don't know how they're going to resolve it. Clearly, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces are much better equipped and organized and more numerous than the Fano forces, and I think in any kind of a major engagement, the central government forces are likely to win out. But it's not difficult to scatter around in the rural parts of the region and create a lot of difficulty for the central government.
Is the ongoing bloodshed in Amhara and Oromia regions akin to another Pretoria agreement, do you think?
Well, that possibly. I mean, frankly, I don't know whether that is the answer, whether that would solve the problem. I mean, agreements can be signed and broken immediately, and they often are. We've seen too much of that in terms of agreements to end conflict around Africa, not just in Ethiopia, but in all kinds of different conflicts. The easiest part is signing an agreement. The hard part is implementing it and ensuring that it is carried out. And I think one could argue that in the case of these local militias, it's not being fully, the Pretoria Agreement's not being fully carried out in Ethiopia. Other parts of the agreement might not be carried out either. We have to wait and see. But this is, in my view, this is not necessarily the answer.
Many observers are reflecting on the Pretoria Agreement, highlighting that there are still internally displaced persons, IDPs, who have not been able to return to their villages and towns. Additionally, there are reports of people dying due to a lack of humanitarian access to these IDPs. What obstacles or challenges have prevented the implementation of this agreement for many months?
Well, it's my understanding that there has been considerable improvement in humanitarian access since the Pretoria Agreement was signed. But improvement is not necessarily a solution. There are going to be pockets of Tigray or other parts of the country, for that matter, that are not being reached for whatever reason. It may be local reasons, maybe inability to move supplies into a particular area. It may be a breakdown in authority. It may be lack of cooperation by elements of the central government. I mean, I suspect there are many reasons why there has not been full implementation of the humanitarian side of the Pretoria Agreement. But quite frankly, that is to be expected with this sort of a situation. We all know how horrific the situation was in the country, and getting the fighting stopped, which, as I understand it, has largely happened, and getting full implementation of the agreement are two different matters. So a lot of progress has been made, but there's still some distance to go yet, and it's going to require not only the best interests of the authorities in Tigray, but also those of the central government to carry this out and to make sure that the agreement is fully implemented. So it's just a question of not being there yet. But if both sides have good intentions and fully intend to implement the agreement, then I think the country will be in much better shape. If there's any breakdown on any side, then there's a problem.
What recommendation would you give the Tigray interim administration to do so that this Pretoria agreement is implemented anytime soon?
Well,
Fully.
one of the I think still outstanding issues, although it's in the process of being resolved, has been the withholding of food aid by both the World Food Program and the United States, and that caused a lot of problems. Not surprisingly, if the primary donor organization and country are going to withhold aid because of abuses in the system, then a lot of innocent people are going to pay a huge price for that. I think that was a very difficult decision by both the World Food Program, the World Health Organization, the United States. And my impression is that at least the UN is starting to reinstitute the delivery of food and emergency supplies. The U.S. seems to be a little slower to do so. There were a lot of abuses for many different reasons, and it's imperative that not only the central government, but the local authorities in Tigray ensure that the food aid and the emergency supplies go to the people who need them. And that was not happening at one point in time. But it's imperative to impress upon all authorities that has to happen.
Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy recently suggested that Ethiopians should pursue obtaining permanent ports for Ethiopia. Does this imply the possibility of another full-scale war with Eritrea soon?
You conceivably could have an arrangement with Eritrea for an agreement to use Assab, for example, where it would not be owned by Ethiopia, therefore it would not be a permanent port like perhaps they're talking about, but it would be some sort of international treaty that would assure access for an extended period of time. That might be possible. The idea of owning the territory is I think highly questionable. I just can't imagine that Eritrea is interested in doing that. I would be very surprised that Eritrea would be willing to give up on a permanent basis any port or any corridor to a port to Ethiopia. Now, maybe the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea has improved so much over the past couple of years, or the past year particularly, that I'm wrong on that. But somehow I just don't see that happening. So I think any idea of a permanent facility owned by Ethiopia in Eritrea is probably not realistic. But as I say, I don't rule out the possibility of some kind of an agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea that would guarantee for a period of years access to a port like Assab, obviously in return for something. Eritrea is not going to offer that for nothing. So there would have to be some quid pro quo here. I have no idea what that might be, but I don't rule that out.
What if the Prime Minister attempts to invade Assab by force? What do you think the consequences would be?
Well, then obviously you have a return to warfare between the two countries, and a situation that might look something like it did in 1998, when you had an all-out war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I guess I would be very surprised if Prime Minister Abiy would do that. I just don't see that happening either. I mean, it's one thing to say that's what we want. It's another thing to try to implement it unless there is agreement on the other side, on the Eritrean side. And as I indicated, I don't think Eritrea would be willing to give up a land corridor and a port on a permanent basis, but I would not rule out a long-term agreement with appropriate payment of some kind from the Ethiopian side.
Recently, the Prime Minister said there was no discussion on these ports and access to the sea. Discussion is not over.
Well, I think that's appropriate. I mean, Ethiopia and Eritrea still do have, as I understand it, rather good relations. And it would be appropriate for Prime Minister Abiy to make use of those good relations and obtain whatever possible benefits he can get from Eritrea at this time. Until there was this agreement between the two countries on the war in Tigray, there was no possibility of this. They didn't agree on much of anything. But the war in Tigray brought them together and does provide the prospect, anyway, for serious talks about some kind of facility or use of a facility, a port facility, in Eritrea.
Given the circumstance, some believe Isaias of Eritrea wields influence like Wagner forces in Africa. The Eritrean regime has also hinted at the possibility of World War III.
Well, the United States has, I think, generally given up on Eritrea as a reasonable interlocutor. Increasingly, as Eritrea has solidified its ties with not only China but particularly with Russia, the ties to China are more explicable in that there are economic benefits to that. China is investing more in Eritrea, and I think Eritrea and Isaias can show some benefits for that. It's a little hard to show benefits for the relationship with Russia at this point. And let's remember that Eritrea was the only country in all of Africa that initially supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was noticed by the entire West. I mean, it was like waving a red flag against the West. And I think consolidated the view that Eritrea was just not a very useful interlocutor in anything anymore. That has continued to be the case, in that the relationship between Russia and Eritrea has solidified, and yet it's still not clear to me how Eritrea benefits from this. Now, do they offer a military facility and somewhere on the Eritrean coast for Russia? Maybe so. That would benefit Russia. I'm not sure how much it would benefit Eritrea, unless the Russians are paying a lot of money for it. The Russians don't have a lot of money at this point, so I'm not sure that's a very good solution. But it's hard for me to judge the degree of concern that exists in either the United States or the West at the moment over what Eritrea is doing vis-a-vis particularly Russia. I'm sure there is some concern. But at the same time, I think there's a certain feeling that Isaias may be sort of getting beyond his ability to control the situation. And that is not necessarily going to work to his advantage.
Has there been any credible evidence to support Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki's claim regarding the disruption of Eritrean festivals in Europe and North America by the United States and PLF?
I didn't catch part of that question, Detroit. Could you restate it?
The Eritrean government was claiming that the TPLF forces and the United States government were organizing youth to disrupt the Eritrean festivals all over the world.
This is the first I've heard of that. I'd be very surprised if there were any truth to it. I mean, what would be the point of it? It's just, I mean, we have enough issues in the United States that would be so far down the list of things that I think the U.S. government would be interested in doing that I just find it hard to believe that is under consideration. But I frankly have not heard of this before.
You know, recently in Europe, for example, in Germany, Sweden, Canada, and Seattle, there were Eritrean festivals disrupted by the opposition groups. Then the Eritrean government came up with an excuse, pretext that the TPLFists and the United States government are organizing to disrupt my festivals all over the world.
Part of the issue may be that I was on vacation and simply didn't even see these reports, but it just strikes me as a kind of thing that the U.S. government wouldn't pay any attention to. I mean, all kinds of ethnic groups have all kinds of festivals all over the United States all the time, and the U.S. just allows them to go forward unless they're aimed against the U.S. government, and these don't seem to be. There's no point in getting involved.
Human Rights Watch's extensive investigation includes first-hand accounts from 42 people and the verification and geolocation of over 100 videos.
Human Rights Watch reported a global outcry over alleged Saudi security forces massacres of Ethiopians at the border, including reports of forces asking immigrants how they prefer to be killed. What recommendation do you have for addressing such a mass tragedy?
Well, I'm familiar with the Human Rights Watch report. It is truly tragic and horrific, and it clearly calls for bringing this to the Saudi government and getting some answers from them as to how this was permitted to happen. And perhaps that's been done, I don't know, but if it hasn't been done, it needs to be done. Fortunately, the report, which is very recent, it's come out just in the last couple of days, has been widely reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post, which means that it will, I think, get attention at high levels of the American government, probably other governments too. And hopefully some kind of action will be taken. I haven't seen any reaction yet from the Saudi government. I haven't seen any explanation, any denial, any comment at all. That doesn't mean there has not been anything, but it would appear that there has been very little so far coming out of the Saudi government. But this kind of thing just cannot be excused or allowed in the future, and yet it does happen periodically in various parts of the world, and in this case along the Yemen-Saudi border. Most of the migrants from Ethiopia into Saudi Arabia in years past have gone to look for work, for jobs, basically, for economic gain. And the Saudi government has allowed many of them to enter the country. For whatever reason, it seems in this case to be cracking down. And I don't know why the change in approach. Some of these people are also seeking asylum, or as the Human Rights Watch report indicated, they're fleeing human rights concerns in Ethiopia. So it's a combination of those seeking a better economic existence on the one hand, and those fleeing concerns, deep concerns, obviously. If you're going to make this trek across the Red Sea and the entire length of war-torn Yemen, you have to be very, very desperate. And these people obviously are desperate. So I don't know as though I have any recommendations per se, except to ensure that there be a Saudi response to this, and ideally to make sure it doesn't happen again.
The ongoing conflict in Sudan between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces continues to inflict profound damage on the country. In your expert opinion, do you foresee any prospects for a resolution to this tragic situation soon?
I don't. And I've been very pessimistic on the conflict in Sudan since the fighting broke out between the Sudan armed forces and the rapid support forces. I have never indicated any particular optimism that any of these efforts at mediation or resolution were likely to occur. And I'm no more optimistic today than I was at the beginning. It's almost as though Sudan is headed towards a failed state status. And it's been exacerbated by the situation in Darfur, which has taken on other implications going well beyond conflict between the rapid support forces and the Sudan armed forces, but it's become an ethnic conflict between what are referred to as the African elements of Darfur and the Arab elements of Darfur, although they're essentially all Muslim and their cultures are very similar. It's sort of the farmers versus the nomads, if you will. That has taken a turn for the worse in the last several weeks. And the conflict has extended to some extent in South Kordofan and Blue Nile provinces. So the situation is worse than what it was at the beginning, with no indication of bringing it to an end in the Khartoum capital area. So I applaud all of the efforts to bring it to an end, the mediation efforts and the African Union efforts. But I'm not optimistic that it's going to have any impact anytime in the foreseeable future. You have two groups who are absolutely committed to holding power, and they're only interested in power for themselves. They are not interested in the betterment of the country or in the well-being of the Sudanese people.
Former President Trump and 18 other individuals are facing a 41-count indictment in Georgia. What potential outcomes do you foresee from these proceedings, and could such legal actions potentially lead to instability in the United States?
I suppose anything is possible in the United States these days, in view of what has happened in recent years, where we have seen a lot of surprises. I don't think, in my own opinion, that it will lead to instability. I think we are better than that. I think that most Americans still are committed to our democratic experiment, which continues to face challenges and has faced some very severe challenges in the past several years. But I think it will. I think the center will hold, in my view. As far as how this all turns out over the next 2 years, frankly, I don't know any more than anyone else does. I think that the people who are being charged will try to draw out the legal process for as long as they can, for their own purposes, their own reasons. And I think that they may be successful in doing that, at least on some of the charges. There are 4 different trials now involving the former president. And the likelihood of getting through 4 trials between now and the next election is not likely, even in the best of situations. Our legal system is just more fraught with hurdles to overcome by the defense than that will allow to happen. I do think that 1 or 2 of the trials can be completed before the election, and that will help clarify things to some extent. But we're in a very fraught period in the United States. We're in unknown territory. Nothing like this has ever happened before. There could be all kinds of surprises down the line, and I don't rule that out. But I still believe that the majority of the American public want to maintain our democratic experiment and see that it works. and that we will, one way or the other, get through this.
Would he, former President Trump, be allowed to campaign and run for president while he's indicted and obviously going back and forth to court?
I believe so. That seems to be the predominant opinion in the United States. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so there's some talk about certain elements of the Constitution that might disallow that. I'm not sure I fully understand the interpretation of that. My guess is he will be allowed to continue to contest for the presidency. But again, we may see all kinds of surprises that we've never experienced before.
He was requested by the Georgia prosecutor office to surrender. And of course, Trump said he would surrender. What does it mean? Does it mean that he is surrendering but not going anywhere, or how does it work?
He's just beginning the court process. He's effectively agreeing to go to trial, and he's posted a bail of $200,000. He has agreed not to do certain things during this run-up to the trial. He has asked that the trial not begin until 2026. That would be after the elections are over with in the United States, and I think he's asked for that date because he thinks that he has a good chance of winning the presidency, and at that time would be in a position to pardon himself if he were convicted of anything. I doubt that our system will allow him to postpone the trial that far into the future. The prosecutors will insist upon an earlier trial than that. But he would be, as far as I understand it, he would be allowed to campaign and take part in the election.
My last question here, Ambassador Shinn. In our last interview, you mentioned that you are older than President Biden. What do you do to maintain a youthful appearance?
Well, I think a lot of luck. And sometimes I don't feel so youthful. But it's important to stay both physically and mentally active. And if you ever let down on either of those, then you start, I think, deteriorating rather quickly. But you have people like Henry Kissinger, who's now 100, who, although physically has changed a great deal at age 100, he's still mentally very active and thoroughly engaged and has lost nothing mentally. So he obviously is doing a lot of things right, and then there are others like him who have done equally well. But age takes a toll, there's no doubt about it. And I think as a result of the age issue, this is probably the single greatest challenge that President Biden faces, even among his supporters. There are concerns as to what 4 more years would do after the current term has expired. He will be 85 or 86 at that point. And, age takes its toll. There's no question about it.
Ambassador Shinn, we sincerely appreciate your enlightening discussions with Tigray Press today. And we look forward to the prospect of further insightful conversations with you in the future. Thank you very much for your time and expertise.
Thank you, Bisrat.
Ladies and gentlemen, we extend our gratitude to you for tuning in with us today, and we look forward to your presence again next week. Thank you for joining us.